At 38 years old, Marlowe Treadwell had been a widow for 11 months, homeless for 2 hours, and desperate for exactly 14 minutes when she remembered the rusted metal shed her husband died trying to save for. The memory arrived while she sat behind the wheel of Kieran's old pickup engine, idling in the gravel turnout 5 miles past the county line. Her son occupied the passenger seat in absolute silence. Callum had stopped speaking around the time his grandmother threw the duffel bag containing their clothes onto the porch and locked the front door from inside. The boy possessed his father's build, lanky and broad-shouldered at 15, and his father's way of processing grief by turning inward until the pressure found its own release. Marlowe's hands remained locked on the steering wheel, though the truck wasn't moving. The vinyl cracked under her palms. November wind rattled the windows. Eastern Kentucky stretched out before them in shades of brown and gray, the trees skeletal against a sky the color of old dishwater. She had $340 in her wallet, half a tank of gas, and no plan beyond driving until the road presented an option that didn't feel like surrender. The fight with Vera had been building since February, since the day the foreman called to say Kieran wouldn't be coming home from the construction site. Since the funeral where Vera stood dry-eyed and rigid while Marlowe wept into Callum's shoulder. Since the first night in Vera's house when the older woman made it clear this arrangement was temporary charity, not family obligation. Vera had found the letter that morning. Marlowe kept it folded in her jewelry box, the last piece of correspondence she'd sent Kieran before the accident. She'd written it the night before he took the job at the bridge project. The one with the safety violations and the desperate contractor and the pay that would finally let them stop worrying about the electric bill. The letter begged him not to go, begged him to wait for something safer, something that wouldn't require him to work 40 feet above the ground on scaffolding that swayed when the wind picked up. She'd never mailed it. He'd taken the job anyway, kissed her goodbye at 4 a.m. and died before lunch when a support cable snapped and sent 3 men and half a ton of steel into the river below. Vera found the letter and understood immediately what it meant, that Marlowe had known, that she'd tried to stop him and failed, that maybe if she'd tried harder, said the right words, made the right threats, Kieran would still be alive. The older woman's voice had been cold as river stones when she spoke. You wanted him to be less than he was. You wanted him to play it safe while bills piled up and his son needed new shoes. He took that job to prove he could provide for this family, and you made him feel like a coward for doing it. Marlowe hadn't argued, hadn't defended herself. The truth was more complicated than Vera's accusation, but defending herself required energy she didn't have. She'd simply walked to the bedroom she'd been sharing with Callum for 11 months and started packing what would fit in 2 duffel bags. The sound of drawers opening and closing had drawn Callum from his room. He'd stood in the doorway watching her fold clothes with mechanical precision. His voice came out small and uncertain. Mom, what's happening? We're leaving. Where are we going? I don't know yet. She'd expected him to cry, to protest, to beg her to fix things with Vera. Instead, he'd gone to his room and returned 5 minutes later with his own duffel bag packed. The only item visible was the framed photograph of Kieran in dress blues from his deployment years. Callum carried it like it was made of glass. They'd loaded the truck while Vera watched from the kitchen window. Marlowe caught glimpses of her former mother-in-law's face between the curtains. The older woman's expression was stone. No regret, no hesitation. Just the cold certainty that she was doing what needed to be done. The door closed before they reached the end of the driveway. The lock clicked with audible finality. Now Marlowe sat in the turnout and tried to think past the panic clawing at her chest. Shelters would take them for a few nights, but not with winter coming. Motels would drain the $340 in less than a week. She had no family left, not since her own father died when she was 16. Kieran's cousins had scattered across 3 states and wouldn't welcome the burden of a widow and her teenage son. She glanced at Callum. He stared straight ahead through the windshield jaw, working like he was chewing words he refused to release. The silence between them felt alive, dangerous, like something that could expand until it swallowed them both. Marlowe heard herself speak. "I'm sorry. For all of this. For not being able to fix it." Callum's eyes shifted toward her. His voice was rough. "It's not your fault. Vera thinks it is. Grandma's wrong." The simple declaration nearly broke her. She blinked hard against tears that had been threatening since they drove away. Losing Kieran had been devastating. Losing their home felt like confirmation that she'd failed at the most basic requirement of motherhood: keeping her child safe. The shed. The memory surfaced again, more insistent this time. Kieran mentioning it maybe twice over the years. Land his grandfather left him 15 acres of hill country and pine forest with a metal building his grandfather used for storing equipment. Kieran talked about fixing it up someday, making it livable, a hunting cabin maybe, or a summer retreat when money wasn't so tight. He never got the chance. But the land was still there. The shed was still there. And unless Vera knew about it, which Marlowe doubted, it belonged to Callum now. She reached across the center console and opened the glove compartment. Registration expired insurance cards, a tire pressure gauge, and underneath it all a folded envelope with Kieran's handwriting on the front. Property documents. She'd forgotten about them entirely. The deed listed the parcel number and a rural route address in Harlan County. 15.3 acres. One structure described as agricultural storage. Kieran's name in faded ink at the bottom. Marlowe pulled out her phone and typed the address into the map application. 43 miles southeast. An hour and change on back roads that probably hadn't seen maintenance since the last administration. The satellite view showed nothing but green canopy and a dirt trail leading nowhere obvious. She looked at Callum. Her son stared straight ahead through the windshield at nothing. His jaw worked like he was chewing words he refused to release. She wanted to tell him everything would work out, that they'd find their footing, that this was temporary. But Marlowe Treadwell had learned young that pretty lies did more damage than hard truth. "We're going to your father's land. There's a building there. It might be livable or it might be a rust pile, but it's ours and nobody can take it from us." Callum's eyes shifted toward her. The first acknowledgement he'd given since they left Vera's house. His voice came out rougher than it should for a 15-year-old. "What kind of building?" "Metal shed. Your great-grandfather used it for farm equipment." The boy processed this. "So we're going to live in a shed, for now, until we figure out what comes next." He nodded once and returned his gaze to the windshield. Marlowe put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The road deteriorated exactly as she'd expected. Pavement gave way to gravel, gave way to packed dirt rutted deep enough to scrape the undercarriage. The GPS lost signal twice. Marlowe navigated by instinct and the fading light, following the route number on rusty signs half hidden by kudzu and wild grape. The forest pressed close on both sides. No houses, no mailboxes, no evidence that humans had passed this way in recent memory. The turnoff appeared suddenly, marked by a wooden post so weathered the numbers were barely legible. Marlowe swung the truck onto what might charitably be called a driveway. Branches scraped the paint. The suspension groaned over rocks and exposed roots. A quarter-mile in the trees opened up into a clearing maybe 2 acres across. The Quonset hut squatted at the far end like a beached submarine. 20 feet wide, 30 feet long, the curved metal walls streaked with rust that bled down from the roof in orange tears. The structure had probably been olive drab, once military surplus, repurposed for civilian use. Now it wore the mottled camouflage of advanced decay. A section of the roof near the peak showed a jagged hole roughly 3 feet across, where the metal had either rusted through or been torn away by some long-ago storm. Marlowe killed the engine. The silence afterward felt aggressive. No traffic sounds, no distant voices. Just wind moving through pine branches and the tick of the cooling engine block. Callum spoke without inflection. "You're kidding." "I'm not. Mom, there's a hole in the roof. I see it. We can't live here. We don't have anywhere else." She climbed out before he could continue the argument. The air bit through her jacket. November in the mountains meant temperatures in the 20s once the sun went down and sunset was maybe an hour away. She walked toward the hut, boots crunching on dead leaves and frost-killed grass. Up close, the structure looked marginally better than complete ruin. The curved walls still held their shape. The framework underneath showed through gaps in the rust, but appeared structurally sound. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but was intact. Marlowe tried the handle. Locked. She returned to the truck and dug through Kieran's toolbox in the bed. The heavy metal box had been his constant companion on job sites battered and dented from years of use. She found a pry bar wedged under a coil of rope and carried it back to the door. The lock gave way on the second try. The door swung inward with a shriek of protesting metal that sent birds exploding from nearby trees. Marlowe stepped inside and immediately wished for a flashlight. Darkness swallowed the interior despite the hole in the roof. What little light penetrated revealed a space empty except for debris. Dead leaves piled in the corners. Something's abandoned nest in the far curve of the wall. The concrete floor cracked and stained, but mostly intact. The air smelled of rust and mold and decades of accumulated neglect. Callum appeared beside her, phone in hand with the flashlight activated. The beam swept across the interior. Marlowe saw more detail now. The metal walls riveted together in overlapping panels. Support ribs every few feet. No insulation, no wiring, no plumbing, nothing but a hollow shell of corrugated steel over a concrete pad. Her son's voice carried an edge close to panic. "We're going to freeze to death." "We're not. Look at this place. It's not even a building. It's a box. It's shelter. That's more than we had an hour ago." Marlowe walked deeper inside, following the phone's light. Her breath plumed in the cold air. The temperature inside felt maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside, if that. The hole in the roof would funnel wind straight down into the space. Any heat they generated would rise and escape into the night sky. But the bones were good. The frame was solid. The floor provided a barrier against ground moisture. And most importantly, it was theirs. Nobody could evict them. Nobody could demand rent they couldn't pay or impose conditions they couldn't meet. She completed a circuit of the interior and returned to where Callum stood near the door. His face in the phone's backlight looked young and scared and trying hard to hide both. "Your father planned for this. He knew this place existed. He would have had ideas about making it work." Callum's expression suggested he thought his mother had cracked under pressure. "Dad's dead. His ideas died with him." The words landed like a slap. Marlowe absorbed the impact without flinching. "You're right. He's dead. But he left us things. Tools, knowledge, and this place. We're going to use what he left us because the alternative is sleeping in the truck until the money runs out and then sleeping in a shelter where they separate families and we lose each other." She watched her son process that. Watched him realize she wasn't exaggerating or catastrophizing. This was their reality now. The shed or nothing. He nodded slowly. "What do we do first?" "We search the truck for anything useful. Then we make it through tonight." They worked in the fading light, emptying the pickup bed and carrying items into the shed. Kieran's toolbox, the 2 duffel bags with their clothes. A sleeping bag Marlowe found wedged behind the seat. A plastic bin containing jumper cables, a first aid kit, and road flares. A tarp folded under the spare tire. Callum discovered the blue tarp while exploring the darkest corner of the shed, a heavy-duty poly sheet spread over something bulky. He called out and Marlowe came over, dragging the tarp aside to reveal a metal footlocker, the kind issued to soldiers. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She knew this box. Kieran kept it in his workshop at Vera's house, a private space where he stored things he didn't want disturbed. The lock hung open. Marlowe lifted the lid and Callum aimed the phone light inside. On top lay a leather-bound journal, the cover worn soft with handling. Beneath it a collection of hand tools, a trowel, a small folding shovel, a carpenter's saw still sharp, maps folded into plastic sleeves. A sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Kieran's distinctive script. Marlowe lifted the journal with shaking hands. She opened to the first page and saw her husband's handwriting, tight and precise, dated 3 years earlier. The entries detailed observations about traditional building techniques, sketches of clay wall construction, notes about insulation values and thermal mass, measurements and calculations and diagrams that showed a mind working through problems he hoped he'd never need to solve. She flipped forward. More entries, more sketches, references to his grandfather Harlan, who apparently knew frontier survival methods from growing up during the Depression. A passage about root cellars maintaining consistent temperatures using nothing but earth and stone. Another about how the Pueblo peoples built homes that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter using adobe bricks. Near the end of the journal, dated 2 years ago, a simple statement that stopped her breath. "If I don't make it home, the shed can become a home. I've mapped everything. Trust yourself, Marlowe." He'd known. Not the specifics, maybe not the day or the circumstances, but the possibility. He'd taken dangerous work and understood the risks, and prepared for the worst outcome while hoping for the best. And when the worst came, he'd left her a blueprint for survival. Her hands trembled as she turned pages. Kieran's familiar handwriting filled margins with calculations. His sketches showed cross-sections of walls with clay applied in layers, notes about mixing ratios and drying times and how thermal mass worked to moderate temperature. She'd watched him work on countless projects over their 17 years together, seen him frame additions and pour foundations and install windows with the confidence of someone who understood how materials behaved under stress. He'd tried to teach her some of it, explaining joist spacing and load calculations while she handed him tools. She'd absorbed more than she realized through osmosis and observation. Now those fragments of knowledge felt precious, essential, like puzzle pieces that might fit together into something that could save them. Callum peered over her shoulder at the journal, looked at the sketches with growing comprehension. "Is that Dad's writing?" "Yes." "What is all this instructions? Plans?" He was figuring out how to make this place livable. Her son took the journal and paged through it, slowly studying the sketches. His expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching wonder. He really thought this through. Marlowe picked up the sealed envelope and tore it open. A single sheet of paper inside folded once. She unfolded it and read by the phone's light. "Marlowe, you survived your father's death at 16. You raised Callum when I deployed. You're stronger than you know. Build what I couldn't finish. I love you. K." The grief hit her sideways. Not the raw anguish of those first weeks after the accident, but something deeper and more complicated. Kieran had believed in her, had prepared this escape route knowing she might need it, had died trying to earn money that would make this transformation easier. The tears came without warning. Not the racking sobs that had consumed her at the funeral, but quiet streams that traced cold paths down her face. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her jacket pocket over her heart. Callum watched her with concern that made him look older than 15. "Mom, I'm okay." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "We need to get organized before we lose the light completely." They worked with new purpose. Marlowe spread the tarp across the driest section of floor and arranged their supplies on it. The sleeping bag would have to serve for both of them tonight. She'd packed a change of clothes each, but no blankets, no winter gear beyond their jackets. The first aid kit contained basic supplies, but no prescription medications. The $340 would need to stretch for food, gas, and whatever emergency supplies they couldn't scavenge or improvise. The temperature dropped as the sun touched the horizon. Marlowe examined the hole in the roof. Too high to reach without a ladder, too large to cover from inside without materials they didn't have. For tonight they'd have to accept the heat loss and focus on not freezing. She found an old oil drum half buried in leaves outside and wrestled it into the shed. Kieran's toolbox yielded a hacksaw. She cut a section from the drum's side to create ventilation, then positioned it in the center of the floor away from the walls. Not ideal. possibly dangerous. But a fire meant survival, and survival trumped safety. Callum gathered wood from the clearing while Marlowe prepared kindling from cardboard boxes she'd saved from their packing. The first aid kit included waterproof matches. She built a small teepee of twigs inside the drum, surrounded it with crumpled cardboard, and struck a match. The flame caught. The cardboard flared bright and hot. The twigs began to smoke and then burn. Marlowe added larger pieces, carefully feeding the fire without smothering it. Heat radiated outward in a small sphere that barely pushed back the cold. Callum crouched beside her, hands extended toward the warmth. His voice was quiet. "How long will the wood last?" "Few hours if we're careful. We'll need to gather more tomorrow." "And then what?" "Then we figure out the next step. And the one after that." They ate dinner from the supplies Marlowe had grabbed before leaving Vera's. Peanut butter on bread. An apple split between them. Water from bottles they'd refilled at a gas station. Not enough to satisfy real hunger, but enough to quiet the worst of it. Darkness came fast and absolute. Marlowe had never experienced this quality of dark. No streetlights, no neighboring houses, no ambient glow from nearby towns. Just blackness so complete it felt physical. She checked the thermometer on Kieran's keyring. 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the shed felt maybe 10 degrees warmer at best, and that was sitting close to the fire. Marlowe spread the sleeping bag near the drum and told Callum to get inside. He hesitated, looking at her with Kieran's eyes. "What about you?" "I'll be fine." "No, you won't." "Callum, get in the bag." "Not unless you do too." They compromised by sitting with their backs against each other, the sleeping bag draped over their shoulders like a cape. The fire burned low. Marlowe fed it sparingly, making the wood last. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant traffic. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. Small animals rustled in the underbrush. The cold was relentless. It crept through gaps in the metal walls, rose from the concrete floor, pressed down through the roof hole. Marlowe's feet went numb first, then her fingers. She tucked her hands under her arms and tried to generate warmth through sheer willpower. Beside her, Callum's breathing gradually evened into something that might be sleep, or might be exhaustion so complete it mimicked sleep. Marlowe stayed awake, kept one eye on the fire, the other on her son's stillness, alert for any sign of hypothermia. The hours stretched. Midnight came and went unmarked except by the slow wheel of stars visible through the roof hole. Marlowe fed the fire one piece at a time, hoarding their supply, knowing dawn was still far away. Around 2 in the morning, Callum started shivering. Not the mild tremors of ordinary cold, but violent shaking that rattled his teeth together. Marlowe pressed her palm to his forehead and felt heat that had nothing to do with the fire. His skin burned against her hand. She dug out the first aid kit and found a thermometer. 99.8 degrees. Low-grade fever. Probably just stress and exhaustion and the shock of their situation. Possibly the beginning of something worse. The acetaminophen bottle held 8 tablets. She gave him 2 with water and made him swallow despite his protests that he was fine. The fever worried her less than the trajectory. If it climbed overnight, if he developed the wet cough that signaled pneumonia, they'd have no choice but to drive back to town and find an emergency room. And that would mean questions from doctors and probably social workers, and possibly losing Callum to the foster system while she scrambled for housing. She held him while the medication took effect. Felt the shaking gradually subside as his body temperature stabilized. Outside, the temperature kept dropping. Inside, the fire burned down to coals. Marlowe added wood, one piece at a time, hoarding their supply, knowing dawn was still hours away. She thought about Kieran working construction 40 feet above the river, about him calculating angles and load weights and safety margins while knowing the margins weren't quite safe enough, about him making that choice anyway because the alternative was watching his family drown in debt. He'd left her the journal, the tools, the land, everything he could give, knowing he might not be there to help use it. She could honor that gift or waste it. build what he'd planned or surrender to circumstance. Callum's breathing evened out into deeper sleep. The fever had broken, or at least stabilized. Marlowe adjusted her grip and stared at the curved metal walls barely visible in the firelight. Tomorrow they'd need water, food, more wood, a way to seal the roof hole at least temporarily. The list stretched ahead of her like a road with no visible end. But they were here, they were alive, and they had shelter that nobody could take away. Around 4 in the morning the fire died to embers despite her efforts. The cold became aggressive, brutal, testing the limits of human endurance. Marlowe pulled Callum closer and wrapped the sleeping bag tighter around them both. His fever had broken, but his breathing stayed shallow and quick. She pressed her cheek against his hair and felt the damp warmth of sweat cooling in the frigid air. Her mind drifted to memories of Kieran she'd been avoiding. Their wedding 17 years ago, small ceremony in a county courthouse with his parents as witnesses. Their first apartment shabby, but theirs where they'd made love on a mattress on the floor because they couldn't afford a bed frame. The night Callum was born, and Kieran held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. The memories hurt. But they also reminded her why she was doing this. Why giving up wasn't an option. Kieran had built a life for them through hard work and sacrifice, had died trying to provide for them. She owed him the effort to survive using what he'd left behind. The sky through the roof hole showed stars, sharp and clear and completely indifferent to their struggle. Marlowe watched them wheel slowly overhead and thought about all the people throughout history who'd looked at these same stars while facing their own impossible circumstances. Some had survived, some hadn't. But all of them had made the choice to try. She would try. For Kieran, for Callum, for herself. Dawn broke gray and cold. Marlowe watched pale light seep through the roof hole and spread across the concrete floor. Frost rimed the metal walls. Her breath steamed in the air. Every muscle ached from a night spent sitting upright. Callum stirred against her shoulder and opened his eyes, looked around at the shed in the weak morning light. His voice came out hoarse. "We made it through the night." "We did." Now what? Marlowe stood slowly, joints protesting. She walked to the footlocker and picked up Kieran's journal, paged through it until she found the entry about clay deposits and thermal mass and building techniques that worked for people with nothing but determination and dirt. "Now we follow your father's plan. We make this place work." Her son sat up straighter, studied her face like he was seeing someone new. "You really think we can do this?" "I think we don't have a choice, but that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because your father left us a blueprint, and I'm not going to waste the last gift he ever gave us." Callum nodded slowly, then stood, crossed to where she waited and looked down at the journal in her hands. "Show me what he wanted us to build." Marlowe opened the journal to a detailed sketch of the shed's cross-section with clay applied to the interior walls. Kieran's notes covered the margins in cramped handwriting. Instructions, measurements, calculations that showed this ridiculous idea might actually work. She traced her finger over her husband's writing and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder and more durable. Determination maybe, or the stubborn refusal to let circumstance win. Outside, the sun climbed above the tree line and painted the clearing in shades of gold and amber. Inside the shed, Marlowe Treadwell stood with her son and studied the plans her dead husband left behind, and decided that today they would begin building the impossible. The clay deposit lay exactly where Kieran's map indicated, 200 yards northeast of the shed, through a stand of white pine that opened onto a ravine. Marlowe stood at the edge and looked down at exposed earth the color of dried blood. November rain had washed away topsoil and revealed the clay beneath a thick vein running along the ravine wall, like an artery cut open to the sky. She descended carefully, testing her footing on loose shale. Callum followed with the folding shovel from the footlocker. At the bottom, Marlowe knelt and pressed her palm against the clay. Cold, dense, slightly damp from recent weather. She scraped away the surface layer and found the color intensified underneath rich terracotta, shot through with streaks of orange. Kieran's journal had devoted 6 pages to clay composition and mixing ratios. The entries referenced his grandfather Harlan's root cellar, which apparently maintained 55 degrees year-round, using nothing but clay and stone. The key was creating a thick enough layer to trap air while remaining thin enough to dry without cracking. 3 to 4 inches. 3 separate applications with drying time between each. Marlowe dug the shovel blade into the clay and levered out a chunk the size of her fist. The material resisted, then yielded with a sucking sound. She broke it apart in her hands. The texture reminded her of sculptor's clay, smooth and plastic when worked but firm enough to hold its shape. Callum crouched beside her and examined the exposed vein. "How much do we need?" "For the first layer, maybe 200 pounds. The journal says we're looking at 3 coats total." Her son did the math visibly. 600 pounds of mud we have to dig out and haul uphill. That's the job. They worked until her shoulders burned and Callum's hands cramped around the shovel handle, filled the plastic bin from the truck with clay and carried it between them back to the shed. Made the trip 4 times before the winter light began to fade. By then they'd accumulated maybe 150 pounds of raw material, which Kieran's notes said would cover roughly 40 square feet of wall surface once mixed and applied. The shed's interior measured approximately 500 square feet of wall space, accounting for the curved ceiling. Simple arithmetic said they'd be doing this for weeks. That night, Marlowe read the mixing instructions by firelight, while Callum prepared dinner from their dwindling supplies. The method was straightforward. Clay water and chopped dry grass in a ratio that produced material with the consistency of thick oatmeal. The grass acted as reinforcement, binding the clay and reducing shrinkage cracks as it dried. She gathered dead grass from around the clearing and cut it into pieces roughly 2 inches long using the carpenter's saw. Callum found an old metal trough outside, battered but watertight. They dumped clay into the trough, added water from the bottles they'd refilled at the creek that afternoon, and began mixing with their bare hands. The cold bit into Marlowe's fingers within seconds. The clay felt like wet concrete, heavy and resistant. She worked it with both hands, breaking up clumps, incorporating water, adding grass in handfuls. Beside her, Callum did the same, his movements methodical and focused. After 20 minutes, the mixture achieved something like the right consistency. Marlowe scooped a handful and pressed it against the shed's interior wall. The clay adhered to the metal surface, sagging slightly but holding. She smoothed it with her palm, spreading it thin, working it into the rivets and seams. The physical sensation of building something with her hands triggered a memory of watching Kieran frame the addition on Vera's house. He'd moved with absolute confidence, measuring twice and cutting once, fitting boards together like puzzle pieces. She'd brought him lunch and stayed to watch him work, fascinated by the transformation of raw lumber into structure. He'd caught her staring and grinned. "You planning to just stand there, or you going to hand me that hammer?" She'd stayed all afternoon. Learn to read a level, practice driving nails straight, listen to him explain load-bearing walls and joist spacing, and how a building was just force and counterforce balanced against gravity. Now she smoothed clay onto metal and tried to hear his voice explaining the physics of thermal mass, how dense materials absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, moderating temperature swings. She couldn't recall his exact words, but the principle remained. Clay would trap warmth from the fire and radiate it back through the night, would block wind that knifed through gaps in the metal, would transform this freezing shell into something that might sustain human life through a mountain winter. Callum worked beside her in silence. His hands moved with increasing confidence as he developed a feel for the material. They covered a section of wall roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall before the light failed completely, and they had to stop. Marlowe stepped back and examined their work. The clay gleamed dark and wet in the firelight. Already she could feel the difference. The section they'd covered radiated cold less aggressively than the bare metal beside it. A psychological effect, maybe. Or maybe Kieran's theory actually worked. Her hands ached. She held them toward the fire and saw blisters forming across both palms where she'd gripped the rough clay. Tomorrow they'd be worse. The day after they'd probably split and bleed. But hands healed, and the work demanded doing regardless of cost. That night the temperature inside the shed climbed to 38 degrees despite the hole in the roof. A small victory, enough to let them sleep for more than an hour at a time without waking from the cold. The pattern established itself over the following days. Rise at dawn. Eat whatever food remained from the previous night. Haul clay from the ravine. Mix. Apply. Work until darkness forced them to stop. Sleep. Repeat. By the end of the first week, they'd covered one complete wall. The clay dried slowly in the November cold, turning from dark terracotta to a lighter rust color as moisture evaporated. Marlowe checked it obsessively for cracks, found a few hairline fractures where the layer had been too thick, filled them with fresh clay mixed thin enough to penetrate the gaps. The second wall went faster. She and Callum developed a rhythm. He hauled and mixed while she applied. Then they'd switch. The work was mindless enough to allow conversation, which happened sporadically and always surprised her when it did. Callum asked questions about his father that he'd never asked while Kieran was alive. What was he like when you met him? Did he always want to do construction? Why did he join the army? Marlowe answered honestly. Kieran at 19 had been cocky and charming and absolutely certain he'd conquer the world through sheer determination. The army gave him discipline and a trade. Construction gave him pride in creating something permanent. And fatherhood had terrified him until the moment Callum was born, after which he became the most devoted parent Marlowe had ever seen. She told stories she hadn't thought about in years. Kieran building Callum a treehouse when the boy was 6. Kieran teaching him to swing a hammer and measure boards. Kieran staying up all night when Callum had pneumonia at 8, holding him while he coughed and whispering that everything would be okay. The stories seemed to feed something in her son that had been starving. He listened with an intensity that suggested he was building his own structure, assembling a father from fragments of memory and second-hand testimony. During the second week, Marlowe's hands split open as predicted, blood mixed with clay and water. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old t-shirt and kept working. The pain became white noise, background static that her mind learned to filter out. On December 1st, they ran out of bread and peanut butter. Marlowe counted the remaining cash, $212, enough for maybe 2 weeks of groceries if they were careful. After that, options narrowed to food banks and charity, which meant exposure to systems that asked questions about housing and schooling and whether a minor was being properly cared for. That afternoon, she opened Kieran's journal to the section titled Appalachian Survival and read about obtaining protein without money. The entries detailed snare construction using wire and small branches, placement along game trails where rabbits moved between feeding and bedding areas, checking traps at dawn when animals were most active. She found wire in the toolbox, fashioned 3 snares according to Kieran's diagrams, carried them into the woods and looked for signs of rabbit passage, found trails marked by droppings and disturbed leaves, set the snares carefully, creating loops that would tighten when an animal pushed through. Callum watched her work with skepticism. "You really think we're going to catch anything your father did? The journal says he learned from his grandfather. That was a long time ago. Things were different. Rabbits haven't changed. They still need to eat. They still use the same paths." She said it with more confidence than she felt. The truth was she'd never hunted anything in her life, never killed an animal beyond spiders in the bathroom. The idea of skinning and butchering a rabbit made her stomach turn, but hunger was a powerful motivator, and she'd learned young that survival meant doing things that turned your stomach. On the third morning, she checked the traps and found one had caught a rabbit. The animal hung suspended in the wire loop, dead from strangulation sometime during the night. Marlowe approached slowly, uncertain what she felt looking at the small brown body. Callum came up beside her. His voice was quiet. "We did this." "Yes. It's dead because of us. It's dead because we need to eat. That's how the world works." She removed the rabbit from the snare and carried it back to the shed. Kieran's journal had a section on field dressing game. She followed the instructions, using the carpenter's knife to make the initial cuts. The work was messier and more difficult than the sketches suggested. Blood ran over her wrapped hands. The smell hit her, hard copper and meat and something organic that made her gag. But she pushed through it, separated hide from flesh, removed organs, cut the carcass into pieces that could be cooked. Callum watched without speaking. His face was pale, but he didn't look away. That evening they ate rabbit cooked over the fire on a makeshift spit. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was protein, and it was free, and it meant the $212 could stretch a little further. Callum chewed slowly, processing not just the food, but what it represented. After dinner, he spoke the words that had clearly been building all day. "I never really understood what Dad did. Going to work, providing. I thought it was just about money." Marlowe waited. "But it wasn't, was it? It was about this. Making sure we had what we needed, even when it was hard, even when it cost him. Your father believed that taking care of family meant doing whatever was necessary. Even dangerous things. Even things that scared him. Did he talk about being scared? Not in words. But I could tell. The night before he took the bridge job, he held me longer than usual, like he was memorizing how it felt." Callum absorbed this, then nodded slowly. "I wish I'd told him I understood. Before. He knew. Your father always knew how much you loved him." The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Callum carried himself differently afterward, moved with more purpose, engaged with the work instead of simply enduring it. By mid-December, they'd completed 3 walls and started the 4th. The interior temperature stabilized around 45 degrees with a fire burning. Not comfortable, but survivable, and significantly better than the 20-degree nights outside. Marlowe marked each small victory in her mind like waypoints on a map. Temperature gain, square footage covered, days survived. The accumulation of incremental progress that meant they were still here, still fighting, still building towards something that might resemble stability. On December 10th, a dog appeared at the edge of the clearing. Marlowe saw it first while gathering firewood. A golden retriever male, maybe 3 years old based on the gray just beginning to show around his muzzle. Skinny enough that ribs showed through the coat, limping slightly on the right front paw. The dog sat 20 yards away and watched her with the careful attention of an animal that had learned humans could be either salvation or threat. She approached slowly, stopped 10 feet away and crouched to appear less threatening, extended her hand palm up. The dog considered, rose, took 3 cautious steps forward and sniffed her hand. His tail began a tentative wag. Up close, she could see burrs matted in his coat and a raw patch on his injured paw where he'd worn the pad down to bleeding. That evening she gave him half her dinner, rabbit and wild onions she'd found growing near the creek. The dog ate with desperate speed, then looked at her with eyes that communicated both gratitude and the hope for more. Callum emerged from the shed and stopped short. Where did he come from? No idea. He's been on his own for a while, though. Her son approached and the dog backed up a step. Callum sat cross-legged on the ground and waited. After a moment, the dog came forward, sniffed him thoroughly, and allowed tentative petting. "Can we keep him?" Marlowe wanted to say they could barely feed themselves, that a dog meant additional expense and responsibility they couldn't afford, that attachments to anything beyond immediate survival were luxuries they didn't have. Instead, she heard herself answering, yes. Callum's face transformed, the first genuine smile she'd seen since they left Vera's house. "He's going to need a name." They debated options while the dog watched with interest. Callum suggested various heroic names. Marlowe countered with practical ones. They settled on Flint because the dog's coat in the firelight reminded her of the sparks that flew when metal struck stone. Flint slept inside the shed that night, curled up near the fire with his muzzle on his paws. His presence changed the atmosphere in ways Marlowe hadn't anticipated. The space felt less like a desperate shelter and more like a home where living things gathered for warmth and safety. Over the following days, Flint integrated himself into their routine. He accompanied them on trips to the clay ravine, alerted them to approaching animals, slept pressed against Callum's side at night, and provided warmth that meant one less log on the fire. The dog also seemed to understand their circumstances with uncanny accuracy. Never begged for food, ate whatever scraps they offered without complaint, made himself useful by barking when strangers approached, which happened exactly once when a county truck rolled through doing some kind of road survey. The driver saw the shed and the dog and kept driving without stopping to investigate. On December 22nd, a different truck appeared, older, moving slowly up the rough driveway like the driver was uncertain about the destination. Marlowe watched from the shed doorway as a woman climbed out. Elderly, dressed in a heavy coat and boots practical for winter weather. She carried a covered dish and approached with the careful friendliness of someone who understood rural protocols. Marlowe met her halfway. Flint stood at her side, tail wagging but alert. The woman smiled. "I'm Constance Lark. Live about 3 miles down the road. Heard through the grapevine somebody was fixing up the old Morrison place. Marlowe Treadwell. This is my son's land. We're making it livable." Constance's gaze traveled past her to the shed, took in the clay-covered walls visible through the open door, the smoke rising from the makeshift chimney Callum had rigged using sections of stovepipe they'd scavenged from a junkyard. Her expression suggested polite skepticism. "That's quite a project you've taken on. Winter's not the best time for building. We don't have the luxury of waiting for spring. I brought chicken and dumplings. Figured you might appreciate a hot meal." Marlowe accepted the dish with gratitude that was only partly about the food. Human contact. Kindness offered without conditions. These things mattered more than she'd realized. Constance followed her inside and examined their work more closely. She touched the clay walls, tested the thickness with her knuckles. Her skepticism deepened. "Honey, I don't mean to discourage you, but mud walls aren't going to keep you warm. You need real insulation, fiberglass at minimum. My husband researched this. The clay creates thermal mass. It holds heat. In theory, maybe, but theory doesn't survive a Kentucky winter. You're going to freeze." The words stung because they echoed Marlowe's own doubts, but she kept her voice level. "We appreciate your concern, and the food, but we're committed to this approach." Constance looked like she wanted to argue further. Instead, she nodded. "Well, you know where to find me if you change your mind." She left contact information scribbled on the back of a receipt and drove away, shaking her head. Callum watched from the doorway. "She thinks we're crazy." "Probably. But she brought us dinner. That counts for something." They ate the chicken and dumplings, slowly making it last. The rich flavors tasted almost obscene after weeks of rabbit and foraged plants. Marlowe rationed it carefully, saved half for tomorrow, knew that resources this good couldn't be wasted. 3 days later, Constance returned. This time she brought a passenger. A man maybe 74, lean and weathered with hands that showed a lifetime of manual labor. He introduced himself as Horace Lark, Constance's late husband's brother, retired mason. Heard about what they were building and wanted to see for himself. Marlowe showed him the interior, explained Kieran's research, pointed out how the temperature had stabilized. Horace examined everything with a professional's eye, touched the clay walls, knocked on them listening to the sound, inspected the coverage and thickness. After 10 minutes of silence, he spoke. "Your husband knew what he was doing. This is old-world technique. Adobe principle. The Pueblo peoples used it for centuries. Your thermal mass theory is sound." The relief that flooded through Marlowe was almost physical. Validation from someone who understood construction. proof that she wasn't leading her son into disaster through stubborn ignorance. Horace continued, "You'll want to seal the roof hole before serious snow hits, and that chimney setup is functional but not safe long-term. But the foundation work here, the clay application, that's solid craftsmanship. We're learning as we go. You're doing fine. Better than fine." He turned to his truck and returned with a cardboard box. 2 old windows salvaged from a remodel, some scrap lumber, a box of nails. Not much, but better than nothing. "We can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. Neighbors help neighbors. That's how it works in these mountains." Constance added her own contribution. A stack of heavy blankets, a bag of dried beans, a jar of honey. Small things that transformed their immediate prospects. Marlowe felt something crack in her chest. The rigid control she'd maintained since leaving Vera's house. The determination to handle everything alone without asking for help or admitting vulnerability. These strangers offering kindness without expectation or judgment made it impossible to maintain that armor. She managed to thank them without breaking down. Barely. After they left, she sat on the ground outside the shed and let herself cry. Not from despair, from the overwhelming grace of being seen as worthy of help. Callum sat beside her without speaking, Flint pressed against her leg. They stayed that way until the cold forced them back inside. That week marked a shift in momentum. With windows to install and lumber to work with, Callum found new purpose. He studied Kieran's technical drawings, figured out how to frame window openings in the metal walls, cut lumber to size using the carpenter's saw, installed the windows with a care that suggested he was building something permanent rather than temporary. The physical transformation of the space accelerated. Natural light flooded in, ventilation improved. The windows could be opened for air circulation or closed against wind. Small changes that accumulated into significant improvement. Callum also built shelves along one wall. Simple construction but sturdy. They moved supplies off the floor and created organization that made the shed feel less like a disaster zone and more like a deliberate living space. During this work, her son began talking about his father in present tense, not as someone gone, but as someone whose influence continued. "Dad would have done it this way. Dad's journal says to brace the joints." Dad knew what he was talking about. Marlowe recognized the shift. Callum was integrating his father's knowledge, making Kieran's expertise his own, building a relationship with a dead man that paradoxically felt more substantial than some of their interactions when Kieran was alive. On December 28th, after Callum had gone to sleep, Marlowe opened the journal to sections she hadn't yet read. Found entries from the final weeks before Kieran's death. The handwriting showed stress, letters cramped and uneven. The job pays $3,200, enough to buy insulation materials, proper windows, a wood stove for the shed. "I know it's risky. The foreman warned me about safety violations. The scaffolding sways in wind. The cables look worn. But if I die, at least Marlowe will have the money to finish what I started. I'm not stupid. I know the odds. But I also know my wife. She'll survive. She'll build. She'll teach Callum everything I couldn't. If you're reading this, Marlowe, I'm sorry I left you. But I'm not sorry I tried to provide. Build the home I couldn't finish. You're capable of miracles. I love you. Always." The entry was dated 6 days before the accident. Kieran had known, had calculated the risk and accepted it, had died trying to buy materials that would have made this transformation easier. The grief that hit Marlowe wasn't fresh mourning. It was complicated recognition. Kieran had loved them enough to gamble his life, had believed in her capacity to survive his absence, had prepared as thoroughly as possible while knowing preparation couldn't eliminate all dangers. She wanted to be angry at him for taking that risk, for leaving them alone, for believing a check could compensate for his absence. But anger couldn't coexist with the evidence surrounding her. The journal, the tools, the land, the blueprint for survival that was actually working. He'd given her everything he could, and she was building what he'd envisioned, honoring his final request by refusing to surrender. Marlowe closed the journal and placed it carefully back in the footlocker. Tomorrow they'd finish the fourth wall, start the second coat, continue the grinding work of transformation. But tonight she let herself feel the full weight of what Kieran had given them. Not just plans and property, purpose, and the belief that she was strong enough to carry it forward. The weeks between Christmas and late January blurred into repetition. Haul clay, mix, apply, let dry, repeat. The second coat went on smoother than the first. Her hands had calloused into leather. Callum moved with the confidence of someone who'd found his rhythm. By January 15th, they'd completed the second layer on all walls. Temperature inside climbed to 48 degrees with the fire burning, 52 if they kept it going through the night. The improvement was measurable, significant, proof that Kieran's theory translated into reality. Horace visited twice more, brought a used wood stove he'd replaced in his own home, helped them install it properly with adequate clearance and a chimney that vented safely. The stove transformed their heating situation, burned wood efficiently, radiated warmth that filled the entire space. With reliable heat, Marlowe tackled the roof hole, used scrap metal from a junkyard and roofing tar Horace donated, climbed onto the curved roof and patched the opening section by section. The work was dangerous and cold and necessary. When she finished, the shed was finally sealed against weather. The third coat of clay went on in early January, thinner than the previous layers, applied more for sealing hairline cracks than adding mass. By January 25th, the interior walls gleamed with a smooth terracotta finish that looked almost professional. Marlowe stood in the center of the space and tried to recognize it as the freezing metal shell they'd entered 2 months earlier. The transformation seemed impossible, but the evidence surrounded her. Warm walls, functional windows, a stove that turned wood into heat that lingered for hours. They'd built this. She and Callum and the dog who'd shown up when they needed companionship most. Built it from mud and determination and the knowledge a dead man had left them. That evening they cooked a meal on the wood stove, rabbit stew with wild onions and dried beans, bread made from flour Constance had brought, tea from pine needles and honey, simple food that tasted like victory. Callum fed Flint scraps and scratched behind the dog's ears. His contentment was visible. This boy who'd been silent and traumatized 8 weeks ago now smiled easily and talked about spring plans. A garden. Chickens, maybe. Improvements to make the space even more livable. Marlowe listened and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The quiet satisfaction of having faced the impossible and survived it, of having honored her husband's final gift by building what he'd planned. The radio on Kieran's workbench crackled to life during the evening news. She'd been monitoring weather reports obsessively, knowing winter's worst could still arrive despite their preparations. The forecaster's voice carried professional urgency. Major winter storm system approaching from the northwest. Expected arrival within 72 hours. Significant snowfall accumulation. Temperatures dropping to single digits. Residents advised to stock emergency supplies and prepare for extended power outages. Callum looked up from where he sat reading his father's journal. That sounds bad. It does. But we'll be okay. Right, Marlowe examined the shed's interior. The clay walls that had seemed like desperate insanity 2 months ago. The windows and stove and organized supplies. The firewood stacked against the exterior wall. The water stored in clean containers. The food preserved and rationed. They'd prepared for this, built toward this exact test. Everything Kieran had planned, everything they'd executed. It would either work or it wouldn't. And they'd know within 72 hours whether his theory could sustain them through winter's worst assault. We'll find out. But whatever happens, we did this together. Your father gave us the blueprint. We built it. That's something nobody can take away. Callum nodded and returned to reading. Flint sighed and settled deeper into sleep. Outside, the temperature continued to drop as the storm system approached from the northwest, gathering strength, preparing to test everything they'd built against the simple question of whether human determination could overcome physical reality. Marlowe fed another log into the stove and watched the flames catch. Tomorrow they'd gather extra firewood, seal any remaining gaps, make final preparations. Tonight she'd let herself feel something close to confidence. They'd survived this far, built a home from nothing, honored Kieran's memory by refusing to quit. The storm was coming, but they were ready. And that would have to be enough. The sky turned the color of old pewter on the morning of January 26th. Marlowe recognized the quality of light from childhood winters in these mountains. The particular weight of the air before a major storm, the stillness that preceded violence. She stood outside the shed with the radio pressed to her ear, listening to the updated forecast. The meteorologist had abandoned cautious phrasing in favor of direct warnings. This system was tracking colder and slower than predicted. Snowfall totals revised upward to 16 to 20 inches. Wind gusts potentially exceeding 55 miles per hour. Temperature plunged to -8 degrees by the second night. Power outages expected across the region. Travel impossible for up to 72 hours. Callum emerged carrying an armload of firewood. He'd been at it since dawn, methodically transferring their stockpile closer to the door. How bad? Bad enough that we need to assume we're on our own for at least 3 days. They spent the morning sealing every gap they could find. Marlowe caulked around the windows using material Horace had left. Callum reinforced the door frame with weather stripping fashioned from old rubber. Flint watched from his position near the wood stove, sensing the urgency in their movements. By noon, they'd accumulated enough firewood to maintain heat for 5 days, assuming careful rationing. Water containers filled from the creek before it froze solid. Food inventory conducted and organized for efficient access. Flashlights tested, batteries checked. Every preparation Marlowe could imagine completed or underway. Constance's truck appeared around 2 in the afternoon. The older woman climbed out wearing the expression of someone delivering news she expected to be rejected. She got straight to the point. "Horace and I want you at our place. We've got a generator, full pantry, enough space for all of you, including the dog." Marlowe appreciated the offer more than she could articulate. "But we need to know if what we built works. Honey, this isn't the time for testing theories. This storm is going to be brutal. Everything we've done for the past 2 months has been building toward this test. If the shed can't protect us now, then we need to know. We need to understand what failed so we can fix it." Constance studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. "You're as stubborn as your husband was, I expect." She jerked her chin toward the shed. "You really think those mud walls will hold heat when it's 10 below zero? I think we've come this far on faith and work. We'll finish the same way." The older woman pulled a piece of paper from her pocket and pressed it into Marlowe's hand. "Our phone number. Landline. Call if things go sideways. We'll come get you regardless of conditions. Thank you for everything you've done. Just stay alive. That's thanks enough." After Constance left, Callum voiced the question that had probably been building. "Mom, are we being stupid about this?" "Maybe. But we can't live our lives always choosing the safe option. Your father understood that. Sometimes you have to test what you've built against the worst conditions to know if it's real. And if it's not real, if we freeze, then we'll know we tried. That matters too." Her son nodded slowly, then returned to his preparations with renewed focus. The first flakes arrived shortly after dark, large and dry, falling straight down in the windless air. Marlowe stood in the doorway and watched the clearing begin to disappear under accumulation. Within an hour, the ground was white. Within 2, the world beyond 20 feet had vanished into curtains of falling snow. Inside the shed, temperature held at 50 degrees, with the wood stove burning at moderate intensity. Marlowe had marked a thermometer to the wall where she could monitor it constantly. Every degree mattered now. Every fluctuation told her something about how the clay walls were performing. They ate dinner early. Rabbit stew stretched with dried beans and wild onions. Bread toasted on the stovetop. Pine tea sweetened with honey. Food that would sustain them through whatever was coming. Callum read aloud from his father's journal while they ate. Entries about thermal dynamics and heat retention. Calculations showing how mass and insulation work together to moderate temperature swings. Kieran's handwriting crossed the pages with absolute confidence in the numbers. Your dad really believed in this, didn't he? He believed in us. The science was just his way of showing how it could work. The wind arrived around 8, started as a low moan through the pine trees and escalated within 30 minutes to sustained howling that made the shed's metal skin vibrate. Snow changed from vertical fall to horizontal assault. The world beyond the windows became white chaos, illuminated occasionally by lightning that accompanied thundersnow. Marlowe checked the thermometer. 48 degrees. 2-degree drop since dinner. Not catastrophic, but concerning. She added another log to the stove and adjusted the damper to maintain steady burn without wasting fuel. Callum sat with Flint pressed against his side. The dog's ears were pinned back, distressed by the storm's violence. The boy stroked the golden coat rhythmically, providing comfort or receiving it or both. By 10, the temperature had stabilized at 47 degrees. Outside registered -2, according to the thermometer Marlowe had mounted near the door. A 49-degree differential. The clay walls were working, trapping warmth generated by the stove, blocking wind that would otherwise suck heat through every gap in the metal skin. She allowed herself cautious optimism. They might actually survive this. The night stretched long. Marlowe dozed, sitting up, waking every hour to check temperature and tend the stove. Callum and Flint slept curled together on the raised platform bed he'd built, insulated from the concrete floor by layers of blankets and cardboard. The storm continued its assault without pause. Wind screamed, snow accumulated, temperature outside plummeted to -6 by 3 in the morning, inside held at 46 degrees. Dawn came gray and savage. Marlowe stood at the window and looked out at a landscape transformed. Snow had drifted against the shed's eastern side to a depth of nearly 4 feet. The clearing was unrecognizable. Trees bent under the weight of accumulated ice. The world had become hostile and alien, but they were warm, alive, protected by walls they'd built from mud and determination. Callum woke and checked the thermometer immediately. His face showed relief. It's holding. So far. We've got at least 2 more days of this. They maintained routine as much as possible. Breakfast. Wood inventory. Monitoring temperatures. Small tasks that provided structure and purpose. Flint needed to go out but refused to leave the shed. Marlowe didn't blame him. The wind chill outside would kill exposed skin in minutes. By noon on the second day, snow accumulation exceeded 15 inches and showed no sign of stopping. Wind gusts rattled the shed hard enough to make Marlowe wonder about structural integrity. But the curved shape held. The clay walls absorbed vibration. Nothing cracked or failed. Temperature inside had drifted down to 45 degrees despite the stove burning continuously. Not dangerous yet, but trending wrong. The cold outside was simply too aggressive for their heat generation to fully counter. Marlowe rationed firewood more carefully, made each log last as long as possible, burned smaller pieces that generated consistent heat rather than large chunks that flared hot and died fast. Kieran's journal had a section on efficient wood combustion. She followed it precisely. That evening they ate a smaller dinner to conserve supplies. Nobody mentioned the rationing. Nobody complained about hunger. They'd all internalized the same calculation. This storm would end. They needed to have resources remaining when it did. Around 9 p.m., with darkness absolute and wind still howling, they heard something over the storm's roar. A sound that didn't belong. Regular, rhythmic, getting louder, pounding. Someone was pounding on the door. Marlowe grabbed the flashlight and rushed to the entrance. Callum was already there, hand on the latch. Flint stood behind them, growling uncertainly. She pulled the door open against wind resistance, and snow cascaded inside. 4 figures stood in the swirling white. Constance, Horace, and 2 people Marlowe didn't recognize, both elderly and bent against the cold. Constance's voice barely carried over the wind. "Our heating system failed. Generator died. These are the Breckenridges. They're 81. We tried to drive to town, but the truck got stuck quarter-mile from your place. We walked the rest." Marlowe didn't hesitate. "Come in. There's warmth. There's room." They stumbled inside, trailing snow and frost. Marlowe slammed the door shut and latched it. In the sudden relative quiet, she could hear Constance's labored breathing and the chattering teeth of the elderly couple. Horace was already moving toward the stove, hands extended. His face was dangerously pale. "We wouldn't have made it another 10 minutes out there." The Breckenridges introduced themselves as Jasper and Lorraine, both moved with the fragile care of people in their 9th decade. Lorraine's lips were blue. Jasper's hands shook uncontrollably. Marlowe and Callum went into crisis mode without discussion. They settled the elderly couple closest to the stove, wrapped them in blankets, made hot tea with the last of their honey, offered food from their carefully rationed supplies. Constance watched with visible emotion. "You're giving us everything you have. We're sharing what we have. That's different." The shed that had felt spacious for 2 now held 5 people and a dog, but the crowding brought its own warmth. Body heat supplementing the stove, breath clouds rising and mingling, the fundamental comfort of not facing disaster alone. Horace examined the interior with professional appreciation. "Your temperature in here has to be 45 degrees at least. Outside is -8. That's a 53-degree differential maintained during a blizzard." "Your husband was a genius." Callum spoke up, voice carrying pride. "My father understood how things worked, how to make materials do what you needed." Jasper looked at the boy with interest. "Your father was Kieran Treadwell." "Yes, sir." The old man's expression shifted to recognition. "I knew your great-grandfather Harlan, worked with him on WPA projects during the Depression. That man could build anything from nothing. Taught me half what I know about construction." Marlowe felt something settle into place. The connection between generations. Harlan teaching Jasper, Harlan teaching Kieran's father. Kieran learning and documenting and passing the knowledge forward through journals and plans. And now she and Callum executing that accumulated wisdom, while people who'd known the origin of it sat warming themselves by the result. Lorraine spoke for the first time, her voice thin but clear. "I knew Harlan too. He taught me about clay building when I was a girl. My father wanted to build a root cellar, and Harlan showed us how. Said it was old knowledge from people who understood that Earth provides everything you need if you respect it." She touched the wall beside her with reverence. "This is his legacy, his knowledge surviving in the hands of his great-grandson's widow. That's powerful continuity." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. 6 people and a dog in close quarters tested patience and resources, but it also created forced intimacy that led to stories and connection that wouldn't have developed under normal circumstances. Jasper told stories about the Depression, about building roads and bridges with hand tools and determination, about Harlan Morrison working alongside men half his age and outworking most of them through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Constance shared her own survival story. Widowed at 43, raised 3 children alone, built a life from fragments and faith and the kindness of neighbors who understood that community meant showing up when things got hard. Horace talked about learning masonry from his father, about how working with stone and mortar taught patience, how you couldn't rush a wall or it would fail, how the best builders understood that slow work done right outlasted fast work done carelessly. Marlowe listened and understood she was receiving wisdom. Not instructions or advice, but lived experience from people who'd weathered their own storms and emerged intact. She told her own story in return. Kieran's death, Vera's rejection, the desperate gamble of coming here with nothing but a journal and faith that her husband's final gift would sustain them. Callum contributed memories of his father, small moments he'd been holding private. Kieran teaching him to use a level. Kieran explaining why wood grain mattered when cutting boards. Kieran staying up all night when Callum was 8 and sick holding him, and promising everything would be okay. The stories wove together into something larger than individual experience, a tapestry of survival and connection, and the ways people found meaning in the face of loss. On the third morning, the wind died. The sudden silence was almost shocking after 3 days of constant howling. Marlowe opened the door cautiously and looked out at a world buried in white. Snow had drifted to 5 feet in places. The clearing was unrecognizable. Trees bent under the weight of accumulated ice. The sky was clearing pale blue emerging through breaking clouds. The temperature had climbed to -2, still brutally cold but improving. And inside the shed registered 44 degrees with the stove burning low. They'd made it. 6 people had weathered the worst winter storm in 20 years inside walls made of mud. Horace stood beside her in the doorway. His voice carried quiet awe. "I've been in construction 40 years, seen every kind of building, and I'm telling you what you built here saved our lives. That's not hyperbole. That's fact. We just followed my husband's plans. You honored his knowledge by trusting it. That takes courage most people don't have." They ventured outside in groups, assessed the damage. Constance's truck sat buried to the windows a quarter-mile away. The road was impassable. Power lines were down across multiple counties according to the battery radio. But the shed stood intact. No structural damage, no failures. Other homes in the area hadn't fared as well. They could see smoke rising from Horace's chimney, which meant his house had survived. But reports started filtering in through the radio about burst pipes and collapsed roofs and families huddling in emergency shelters. By afternoon, neighbors started appearing on foot or snowmobiles, checking on each other, sharing news about who was okay and who needed help. Word spread quickly about the shed, about how it had sheltered 6 people and a dog through conditions that had killed 3 people elsewhere in the county. People came to see for themselves, stood in the doorway and touched the clay walls, asked questions about construction and insulation and how something this simple could work this well. Marlowe showed them Kieran's journal, explained the principles, demonstrated the thickness and composition. A woman named Bryn arrived on the 2nd day after the storm. 31. Widow for 6 months. Living in her car because she couldn't afford rent and had nobody to turn to. She looked at the shed with an expression Marlowe recognized, desperation seeking hope. "Can you teach me?" Bryn's voice was steady despite obvious exhaustion. "I have land. Not much, but it's mine. I could do this if someone showed me how." Marlowe glanced at Callum. Her son nodded immediately. "We can teach you. That's what this knowledge is for." Sharing. Over the following week they had 7 more requests. Widows mostly. A few divorced fathers with custody but no home. People who'd fallen through the cracks of conventional support systems and needed something they could build with their own hands. Marlowe found herself becoming a teacher, explaining clay composition and mixing ratios, demonstrating application techniques, sharing Kieran's calculations about thermal mass and heat retention. She'd make copies of journal pages and hand them out like precious documents, which they were. Horace volunteered his time, helped with the construction phases that required experience. Constance organized meal schedules for workers. The community that had formed around Marlowe's survival began multiplying outward. By late February, they'd started 3 separate building projects. By mid-March, 5. Each one used Kieran's methods. Each one proved the theory worked. People called it the Treadwell method. Marlowe tried to correct them to give credit to Harlan and the generations before. But the name stuck. On March 1st, Vera's truck appeared in the clearing. Marlowe saw it from where she was teaching Bryn how to apply clay evenly. Her body tensed automatically. Callum noticed and moved closer. Vera climbed out slowly. She looked older than Marlowe remembered, more worn. She approached with visible uncertainty. Her eyes swept across the shed, taking in the transformation from rusted shell to livable structure. "I saw the news coverage. About the storm. About what you built." Marlowe waited. Let Vera fill the silence. The older woman's voice cracked. "I was wrong. About you. About everything. Kieran left you his knowledge, and you honored it. You built what he couldn't finish. You kept our grandson safe. He's your grandson. You can be part of his life if you want." Vera's eyes filled. "I don't deserve that." Callum stepped forward. His voice was careful but firm. "Grandma, there's always room here, if you want it." The older woman looked at her grandson, then at Marlowe, then at the shed that represented everything she'd dismissed as foolish. "I have money. From Kieran's life insurance. I kept it all. I thought you didn't deserve it because you tried to stop him from providing. But you were right to worry, and he was right to prepare. I want to help improve this place, as partners, not charity." Marlowe considered. The money would buy materials they desperately needed, would allow expansion, better windows, a proper roof. But accepting it meant reconciling with the woman who'd thrown them out in winter with nowhere to go. She thought about Kieran's journal, about legacy and continuity, and how grudges served no one, about how she'd built this life from forgiveness of her own failures and the determination to transform grief into purpose. "We give grace not because people deserve it, but because we all need it eventually. That's something your son taught me." Vera broke down crying. Marlowe crossed the distance between them and held her former mother-in-law while the older woman sobbed against her shoulder. Callum joined them. Three people bound by love for the same man, separated by grief, reconnected by the simple acknowledgement that they'd all done their best in impossible circumstances. Vera moved a small RV onto the property 2 weeks later. Not into the shed, but close enough to be part of their daily life. She helped with the teaching workshops, donated materials and money, reconnected with her grandson through the shared project of helping other desperate people build shelter from nothing. The reconciliation wasn't perfect. Old wounds didn't heal overnight, but it was real, and it mattered. Spring arrived tentatively. Snow melted. Creek levels rose. The clearing around the shed exploded with early wildflowers. Marlowe and Callum planted a garden using seeds Constance had saved from her own harvest. Tomatoes, beans, squash, food that would supplement what they hunted and foraged. Horace helped them build a chicken coop from scrap lumber. 6 hens that would provide eggs and eventually meat. Another step toward self-sufficiency. The shed itself had evolved beyond basic shelter. Clay walls now smooth and finished. Windows that actually sealed. A proper wood stove with adequate clearance. Shelves and storage built from reclaimed materials. Sleeping platforms raised and insulated. The space felt permanent, intentional, like a home people had chosen rather than accepted by default. One evening in early April, Marlowe stood outside watching smoke rise from their chimney. Flint sat beside her, alert and content. Inside, Callum was reading his father's journal aloud to Vera, sharing the knowledge that had sustained them. She thought about the 11 months since Kieran died, the desperation and fear and grinding work, the moments when quitting seemed like the only rational choice, the times she'd questioned everything, including her sanity. But they'd survived, more than survived. They'd built something that mattered. By early April, 8 families had completed clay-insulated shelters using Kieran's methods. Each one weathered the tail end of winter without incident. Each one proved that survival wasn't about having money or connections. It was about having knowledge, determination, and community willing to show up when things got hard. Inside, Callum called out, asking if she wanted tea. Marlowe turned toward the shed and saw lamplight glowing through windows they'd installed together. Saw clay walls that represented hundreds of hours of labor. Saw home not as something you found, but as something you built from determination and knowledge and love that endured beyond death. She walked inside where her son waited with tea and her former mother-in-law sat knitting by the stove and her dog slept peacefully near the warmth. The journal lay open on the table, Kieran's handwriting marching across the page with instructions and calculations and faith that the people he loved would survive his absence. Marlowe picked up the journal and read the final entry aloud. "Build the home I couldn't finish. You're capable of miracles. I love you. Always." Callum listened with his head tilted. "Do you think he knows what we did? I think love doesn't stop when someone dies. It changes form, but it doesn't disappear. Everything we built here we built because he believed we could. That belief is still alive." Vera spoke quietly from her chair. "My son was right about you. You're stronger than you know. I'm not stronger. I just refuse to quit. There's a difference." That night, Marlowe began documenting their experience in a new journal, recording the techniques they'd refined, the lessons learned through trial and error, the community connections that had formed. She wrote not for herself, but for whoever might need this knowledge in the future. The next desperate person looking at impossible circumstances and searching for a blueprint that might lead to survival. Because that's what Kieran had done. Left a blueprint. And she'd followed it to the other side of disaster. Now she'd do the same for others. Pass the knowledge forward. Build continuity that stretched across generations. Callum came to sit beside her. Looked at the new journal with interest. "What are you writing? Instructions. For the next person who needs them. Think anyone will use them. I think people are always going to face situations that seem impossible, and some of them will refuse to quit. Those are the ones who'll need what we learned." Her son nodded, picked up his father's original journal and flipped to the sketches of clay application. His voice carried quiet pride. "Dad would like that. Knowing his work keeps going. It's not just his work anymore. It's ours. We built on what he started. Made it better. Made it real." Outside, spring continued its patient transformation of winter's damage. Flint stirred from sleep and padded over to rest his head on Marlowe's knee. She scratched behind his ears and felt the accumulated weight of the past months settle into something approaching peace. She'd been 38 when Kieran died, 39 when she built a home from mud and determination and his final gift. The journey between those ages had stripped away everything comfortable and revealed what remained when convenience and certainty disappeared. What remained was love, knowledge, the refusal to let circumstance write the ending. Marlowe Treadwell was not broken by grief. She was sharpened by necessity. And in building what her husband had planned, she'd discovered that home was never the house. It was the love that built the walls, the hands that mixed the clay, and the memory that warmed every cold night. Kieran had left her more than plans. He'd left her purpose, and she'd built a life worthy of his faith. She set down the pen and looked at the shed's interior one final time before sleep. The clay walls gleaming in lamplight, the organized shelves holding supplies earned through work and generosity, the journals documenting knowledge that would outlive them all. This was home, built from grief and clay and her husband's last act of faith, built to last, built to matter, built to prove that human beings could survive anything if they refused to surrender. She extinguished the lamp and settled into bed beside her son. Flint sighed contentedly. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal. Inside, warmth lingered in walls that would stand for generations, silent testimony to one woman's refusal to let death have the final word.